Good morning and welcome to the Locksmith Ledger International Education, hosted by myself, Wayne Winton. Today, we're going to be going back to the very beginning and the very basics of lock rekeying. Here is a Google image that was taken off the internet from GMS lock cylinders. We can identify the parts such as the plug, the housing, bottom pins or key pins, top pins or driver pins, springs, spring cover, C-clip, retaining cap, and tailpiece. Here is a different version that has a threaded on retaining cap. It also utilizes a retaining pin spring, and it has a tailpiece that can be put in the key and knob or key and lever formats, meaning that the tailpiece would be at the perpendicular right degree angle along with the Bible or against the housing of the lock. Here is a cutaway cylinder. If you are doing any kind of rekeying, I highly recommend you invest in a cutaway cylinder, and you could literally work right along with us as we go through the video, and the cutaway gives you an extremely good visual aid. The first thing we need to do is identify what kind of keyway we have in lock cylinder. This is a Schlage or SC1 or SC4 keyway. The difference between the two is SC1 is a SC1 is a 5-pin key, SC4 is a 6-pin key. Here I'm showing one of the tools that needs to be identified as a cap screw removal tool, and now we have pinning tweezers. Pinning tweezers have this little notch at the end of the tweezers to allow the pin to be grabbed by the tweezers, and so the pin does not rotate or fall all over the place when you're trying to insert it into a lock. It actually grabs the pin and holds it in place. Another tool you'll need is a Phillips head screwdriver along with a flathead screwdriver, and a good pippin file is always recommended. A good pippin file is usually imported from Italy or Switzerland. Here we have the ProLock KD01 key gauge. I recommend having at least one key gauge, if not more. You're going to need a key gauge at some point in time. Here we see all these numbers written on the key, and these numbers will correlate with the cuts of the key in most cases. This isn't always true, but this is where a key gauge comes into play, where you can double check and you can verify those cuts. So the key gauge will verify the numbers on the side of the key as accurate. To begin rekeying this lock, the first thing that we need to do is identify the retaining pin. We push the retaining pin in to remove the cap or cap screw that I have in my hand and the tailpiece that I have in my hand right here as well. This tailpiece has two different notches to go in two different positions, and you can see that retaining pin is now touching my index finger and is spring loaded, so you need to be very careful at this point to make sure that this retaining pin, or it could be referred to as a detent, does not go flying off into the abyss. Making sure that we have everything over the pinning mat is going to be essential. Here is the retaining cap pin spring that drives that pin into the retaining cap, not to be confused with a key pin spring that I have in my hand here. You can see the difference between the two. A key pin spring is much larger and much thicker than a retaining cap spring. Here I'm showing the hole where that retaining cap spring pin hole and spring goes into. And now we have everything removed from the back of the lock cylinder, so we can insert the key, and I like to rotate 90 degrees. In most cases, that will work. You can see how the keyway is rotated 90 degrees away from the housing or the top or the Bible of the lock. Now, depending on what kind of tailpiece you have, there are different shapes of them. You need to make sure that it's rotated in a way where there will not be a gap created when you use the follower to push the plug out of the lock housing, as you're seeing here. I emphasize the pushing. You never want to pull on the cylinder. You will make the top pins explode into the housing, and you'll have to rebuild that cylinder if you do so. You notice how there's no space in between the follower that's in my hand and the plug that's on the other side. Now you can see the follower in place. What we're going to do is insert the new key, and the new key being inserted shows that the number 1 and number 2 positions, or number 1 and number 2 cuts, are completely different than what the original key was. I always recommend putting in the new key to make sure that it is different and verify that beforehand. Here is a Lab 03 pinning kit. This is a 3000s pinning kit. Now, this is a professional pinning kit that's had a lot of different pins put into it. So there are some pins like these here. These 270s are red. That's an 05 pinning kit, pin colors in a 03 pinning kit. Don't pay attention to the colors right now. The pins are the accurate sizes. This is a number 3 pin, 210 thousandths. And then the final 6th position will take this number 9 cut, or 300 thousandths bottom pin. Now we have the entire cylinder rebuilt. I believe the code is 117339. Again, we're going to make sure that the key is rotated off center so that the pins are not lined up. 90 degrees is preferred, but if you can't do that, whatever works for your particular situation. And again, push the follower out with the plug. When you push the follower out with the plug, never pull. Pulling will result in the top pins getting let out of the chambers and having to rebuild that. Now that we have the plug back in place and we have pulled the key out while leaving the plug in the housing, we then install the retaining pin spring into the retaining pin spring hole, and then put the retaining pin on top of the retaining spring with the small notch or the point pointed outwards. Now we reinstall the tailpiece the same way that it came off. There are 2 different positions that this could be in. You could mount it in this position that we see here, which would be more of a key and knob cylinder format, or directly with the housing of the lock, or the tailpiece lined up with the Bible of the lock would indicate more of a lever situation, key and lever situation. There are definitely exceptions for both, but in most cases, that would be the case. Here, I'm showing a gap between the cap screw and the housing of the lock. This is not good. If your key does not want to come out very easily after you've reinstalled the cap screw, there's a good chance that the cap screw torque is not set correctly. It could be too tight. If you feel that there is binding, then the cap screw could be too tight. If it doesn't want to release the key, then it could be too loose. And what's happening is the key is actually pulling on the pins inside the lock, and it's not releasing it because it's putting pressure on those pins and not releasing the key. The torque specification is extremely important. So here we've got a Lab 03 pin kit, and we're talking about EPD, or the plug diameter, is 500 thousandths. The TFC, or 2 front cut, is 231 thousandths. The BCC, or center to center measurement, is 156 thousandths. And the max, or maximum adjacent cut depth, is 6. Now, there are some places that say that you can go up to a maximum of 7. However, in this particular application, we're going to go with 6 because that is what is printed on the box and the pinning kit here. This means that having a number 7 cut next to a number 1 cut, such as shown on this key here, would be the maximum depth that you could go. This is the maximum that you can have a variance between the two. So we've got a number 1 cut, as I'm showing with my fingernail, and it goes down into a number 7 cut. If we were to continue to cut this any deeper to an 8 or 9, you would then be cutting into that number 1 cut and reducing the amount of space that it has, increasing the angle, and then the pin, the bottom pin or key pin, would start to ride in that angle and actually start to lose traction and actually dip below the shear line and no longer allow it to work. That is the definition of max, and that is why we have the equation for max, and that is why max violations will cause major problems in a lock cylinder if you do not pay attention to it. We'll go into more detail on this in a separate video at a separate time, but just understand that if you are creating a key, that you cannot have any more than a maximum of 6 numbers between the 2 cuts that you're trying to make. So if you're creating a key, a 9 and a 1 is not going to work. A 7 and a 1 is maximum. So I want to show in real time, real video time, the rekeying process. We've tried the cap removal tool or cap screw removal tool, since it does thread on in place, and it does not fit this particular pattern for this particular lock cylinder. So we're going to just need to use a flathead screwdriver or pinning tweezers. Now I'm explaining a little more about pinning tweezers. Pinning tweezers are designed to have a notch cut in to the end portion of the tweezers so that it grabs the pin and it doesn't allow the pin to turn and move and do acrobatics while you're trying to actually install that. You can see a normal set of pinning tweezers here. You can move the pin around and it doesn't hold it very solid. This is extremely frustrating when trying to rebuild a cylinder. You're going to need to have that dexterity in that action of placing it in and holding it in place. If you need to make your own pinning tweezers, I use a Dremel style tool with a tile cutting carbide bit. This is pretty much the same size as the pins, or the same diameter as the pins, and I literally turn on my high-speed tool and pinch the tweezers directly into it. This will cause it to grind out that little groove, and again you can see that it's about the same size or diameter as the pin, and now it grabs onto the pin perfectly. So if you have a pair of tweezers at home, you can make your own pinning tweezers or you can order them, whichever works for you. I recommend having several sets of pinning tweezers. I'm going to go over the tools again here. We've got a Phillips head screwdriver. We've got a cap removal tool or a cap screw removal tool that works with most screw-on cap cylinders. A key gauge is absolutely valuable in this situation. Again, the numbers that are stamped on the key are usually the cuts. However, they may not be. And if they're not, you're going to need to identify those. Here we're going over all of the different followers that we have. Having a master pin follower is absolutely essential to do professional grade locksmith work. Now, again, I'm going to show you that we have a working key. This is the first step in rekeying a lock. If you do not have a working key, we're going to have a separate video on how to service this lock without a working key. So verify that the key works with the customer preferably, and then we're going to depress the retaining or the cap screw retaining pin. As you can see here, we're going to get nice up close and personal. This is all 4K footage through the camera and high quality HD footage. So I'm going to depress that retaining pin down and compress the retaining spring that will allow me to remove the cap or cap screw off of the back of the plug of the cylinder. So we've got the locking cap, we've got the retaining pin, the locking cap retaining pin with that little notch on the top. You can see it right here. And then I usually I'll tap once or twice to get the retaining pin spring out of the housing. When you're working in the field, Sometimes we can have a lot of debris, WD-40, oils, and all kinds of things, graphite, mud, dirt, etc., in that particular hole, and it will actually trap the spring in place. So my rule of thumb is I will tap him several times on the pinning mat, and if it comes out, I will then make sure that we put it in its place so that we can return it. If it does not come out voluntarily through that tapping process, I will assume that there is enough dirt and debris in there to leave it in place and let it go along for the ride for the rekeying process. You could dig it out of there with a small tool, like you see here, a dental tool, a paper clip, a lock pick, or anything else. You could dig in there and actually pull that spring out if you really want to make sure that you keep track of it. However, after doing this for years, I've just figured out that if it doesn't come out when we tap it, it's probably not going to come out in the rest of the rekeying process, so it can stay in there for the ride. So now we're going to go back to the rekeying process. We're going to insert our working key, and you can really watch and see how all of the pins interact with the key, and you can see how they move up and down. You can see how the top pins or the driver pins interact with the springs and interact with the key pins or bottom pins, and how they interact with the cuts of the key to form a shear line. You can see one solid line, all nice and even. That is called the shear line, and when the correct key is inserted, we meet the shear line and the lock is allowed to turn over. Now from this cutaway, you can see the different pins inside the plug of the cylinder, and we have the cylinder broke over now. I prefer 90 degrees in most cases. I will turn the key to 90 degrees. Some tail pieces and some cylinders have extra material removed from them that won't allow this. Now you'll see that I'm using a solid round follower to meet that solid round connection on the plug. I'm also showing that I'm pushing, never pulling. Always push. You're pushing the plug out with the follower, or when you're pushing the follower out with the plug, you're always pushing and never pulling. Pulling equals an exploded cylinder that will have pins and springs go everywhere, and you will have to rebuild that. Now you'll notice I'm using a follower on this. It has two different sides. One side is for mortise cylinders, and the other side is for key and knob cylinders. You'll also notice that there's this notch cut out, and we can now see the springs inside the cylinder. This is for detecting master pins. This is an essential step that often gets overlooked by even some professional locksmiths. Sometimes people do not think that residential homes will actually have master pins in them, but a lot of times with Airbnbs and rental properties, there are a lot of what's called mini master key systems that can be set up on homes, and you need to release those master pins from the housing of the lock in order to maintain security. So what I'm showing here is once those pins gets released, you actually just use a slight rocking motion back and forth. I'm actually rocking that follower in and out with a little bit of torque in the upward motion to be able to seat those pins back up into the housing after we've checked for master pins and possible master keying in that lock. It is your responsibility as a professional locksmith to make sure that you check for master pins and make sure they are removed, in my personal opinion. Now, when we're doing this, you might run into a lock that has security pins or T-pins in the housing. If that is the case, you will use this little trick that I'm showing you where you actually use a pick to shove the key pins back up into their housing while you're applying rotational force or torque on the master pin follower and shoving all those pins back up in there. The notches on a spool pin are what get caught on the sides, and they don't want to allow those pins to go back up into place. They're doing their job as security pins. The little trick with the pick will help solve that problem, no problem at all. Here we're laying out all of the key pins into the individual slots on this pinning mat. Now here we're looking at the numbers on the key. The numbers on the key are the cuts for this particular lock. So we've got, looks like some 5s, some 3s, and some 7s going on. We're going to zoom back out so we can see the pin kit. And you can use your pinning tweezers, you can use fingers, you can use whatever you are comfortable with. But I'm lining the correct pin. I'm looking on the back of the pinning chart to see what pin is actually needed for this particular location. And then I'm going to insert it into the lock itself. Now here I'm bringing the pin kit forward, and you can see that I'm going to zoom in on the Schlage side of things. So I believe one of our next pins will be a 3 cut or 210 thousandths. So that's what the number 210 means, is 0.210 is for 210 thousandths of an inch. That is the length of the pin that you are actually inserting into that particular chamber, and that correlates with the root depth of the cut that is on the key. When you match the correct pin depth with the correct cut on the key, it matches perfectly with the shear line and allows the lock cylinder to turn over. So we've got one number 3 210 thousandths pin locked in place. Then we're going to go ahead and put in the rest of these. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers were. I believe it's 357337. So we've got number 3, we've got a number 5. We're making sure that this is passing the eye test and actually looking at the pin and seeing if it's too high or too low. Now we're installing a number 7 pin, key pin or bottom pin in place. I believe we have a number 3 getting ready to come back in. We've got a number 3 there in place. Another number 3. Didn't get real creative when they pre-cut this key. And then we have a number 7 for the 6th cut. All of these cuts are going to be read from bow to tip. The bow of the key is the head of the key that you grab onto with your fingers. Now here we're going to slide this back in, and again I cannot put enough emphasis on the word push. Now right here we're already running into a little bit of a problem. Just because I pulled a number 7 pin out of the number 7 location on my pin kit doesn't mean that another pin didn't accidentally get dropped into there or something else happened where a pin jumped from one side to another. That's exactly what happened in this case, and this is how you detect it. So once I grabbed another pin from that number 7 location, or a 270 thousandths, it decided to fit right in. One of the adjacent neighboring thicker, larger pins jumped over into that particular spot on my pinning kit, and that is what caused the problem. Now, we're able to pull the key out, and I'm going to give you a very simple tip. You could very easily accidentally pull the plug and the key out of this lock with no follower and make all of the top pins and springs explode into the abyss. We don't want to have that happen. So what I'm showing here is this little pinching technique that I use with my fingers to pinch the key out with my fingers and hold the plug in place with my fingertips. Now we're going to put the cap retention spring pin in place, the cap retention pin in place, and I'm going to depress that using the pinning tweezers, and I'm going to seat the cap screw in place and thread that until it's tight, and then I back it off one. So it's kind of like a axle nut on your vehicle. You bring it tight, you bring it to finger tight, and then I back it off one click. So here I'm showing it's now tight, and I'll back it off one click so that the torque setting is proper so that the key can be removed without binding and it can be inserted and rotated without binding. Now, if you insert the key and turn the lock over and you get a lot of resistance or more resistance than when you first encountered the lock, there's a good chance you over-tightened the cap screw. If you have problems pulling the key out and the key does not want to release, then you most likely have a too loose cap screw. So we need to increase the torque on that. We need to push the detent pin down, or we need to push the retaining pin down and tighten it up just a little bit more so that it goes in place. If you follow the formula of tightening it finger tight and backing it off, you should be good and you shouldn't have to adjust too much more after that. Thank you for watching the Locksmith Ledger's International Rekeying a Kia knob lock cylinder hosted by Wayne Winton. Check out the disclaimer for more information.